welcome to Placecast, a local policy innovation partnership hub production based at the University of Birmingham. Placecast is essential listening for those keen to explore the ins and outs of knowledge mobilisation for influence in central and local government, based on the view that it is only through animating the power of place-based leadership that the wicked problems of 2025 can become more manageable. I'm here today with Professor Mike Woods, who is the principal investigator of the LPIP based in rural Wales, who has a long and distinguished social science career, largely in Wales. And you're Aberystwyth, aren't you, Mike?
That's right, yes.
Brilliant. Well, it's lovely to talk to you. So, obviously, you've worked on Welsh matters for a really long time. Can you tell me what got you interested in work at the Welsh scale?
I mean, a simple answer to that is that I got a job at the Welsh University, but I will preface this a little because my interest starts, I think, with being interested in what's happening in rural areas. And that's an interest I first picked up at undergraduate level, partly having been from a family who moved from a larger town into a rural area. And that struck me as in undergraduate lectures as an interesting social development. And I pursued that through my PhD as well. And then I got a job at Aberystwyth in 1996. And together with colleagues here, we started doing work around rural Wales. And this is what also has got me starting to think more about issues around regional development and economic development. Because of my colleagues were already working in that space. We had within the university a rural service research unit, which had been particularly working with small communities and doing community appraisals and so on. And the first funded project, which I was then involved with colleagues, was looking at partnership working in rural regeneration in mid Wales and the borders. So that's where it all started, and it's developed from there.
I won't embarrass you by suggesting that your career is as old as Welsh devolution, because everybody's very excited about the fact that the Senedd election coming up in May of next year is the 7th general election in Welsh devolution. So in a sense, and I'd love to know your view on this, it feels like that's a set of institutions which is somewhat mature.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, my career predates devolution. In the sense we started working in that before we got that. There were an interesting series of developments. So I think it is a very mature set of institutions now, but it's taken time to evolve to that. And there have been adjustments. So particularly when we think about regional and rural development in Wales, prior to devolution, we had a Welsh Development Agency, but we also had a Development Board for Rural Wales, which was set up in the 1960s. And we're still going in the 1990s when I started working in this space. Actually, I think that in many ways is still fondly looked back on as an organisation which had a clear remit, initially responding to a severe problem of depopulation and a need for modernisation in rural Wales, but then gradually helping to attract in various industries and I think changing its focus over time to smaller scale, growing endogenous businesses and so on. Just prior to devolution, this got merged in together with the Welsh Development Agency as a larger, but still standalone authority. And there were concerns then about some of the distinctive rural elements being lost with that. And then we got devolution and got the establishment of the National Assembly for Wales. And one of the rallying calls in the early days of the Assembly from people like Roderick Morgan, who became then the second First Minister, was that this shouldn't be creating more government, but actually this is democratising government in Wales, and therefore it was a rallying call to the bonfire of the Quangos. And therefore we got, after a few years, the Welsh Development Agency got incorporated into the government structures of the Welsh Government itself. And there's pros and cons about that. There is a sense of it being placed more centrally, that there's democratic control over that. But I think there's also been some concerns that when something goes into government, it gets lost within the larger machinery. And that sense of having a clear organisation doing this for rural areas. So we had recently the Royal Welsh Show, which we'll talk about later on. You were there with us, Nicola, for that. There's a launch by the Welsh Local Government Association of their rural manifesto for the elections next year. And one of the key asks they have in that manifesto is the re-establishment of some kind of public body for rural Wales. And there are various options being talked about. One of it really is going back to, in a sense, reinventing the Development Board for Rural Wales, one of which is a kind of commissioner model. One of it might be some kind of organisation, partnership organisation co-owned by the local authorities. But there is a sense there that there is still a gap for an organisation which can focus more specifically on rural Wales. I think you're right in that we have got to a point in Welsh devolution where the institutions are mature enough to actually deal with that. And that at one time, the emphasis was all about we need to establish the legitimacy of the Welsh government and the Welsh assemblies, first of all, from now the Senedd, reluctance there to really empower tiers of government and empower agencies which are beneath that. I think we're now getting to the point where the Welsh institutions can be confident enough to start giving away some of that power again, so it can be more reflected to place-based interests.
Interesting. I've just been listening to a talk from Kevin Morgan. You all know him very well.
Yeah.
Obviously, his work covers both the rural and urban context. He senses some impatience, certainly within the Cardiff capital region, with the sort of institutions of devolution. They feel quite jealous that Manchester's apparently appears to them to have more freedom and flexibility. But then I was saying, well, again, this Welsh mesh that I observed so clearly from the outward programme of the LPIP over the summer and others, it feels like in some ways a more solid foundation to begin to be, to those specificities can come back to the centre again.
I think this is part of this messiness of devolution in Britain, which we're trying to work through at the moment. And I think we know for a long time Wales and Scotland have been ahead of England in terms of having that devolution, which is the kind of initiatives over the last few years in the both governments, which have set up the city mayors and then combined authorities and so on, are of course then taking devolution further in England. And the same word's being used, and this is one of the confusing things. We're talking about devolution in both contexts, and actually it's quite different in terms of the constitutional and the legalistic setting of these things. And the scale is different. So we're talking about city regions, cities within England, and we're talking about nations in Scotland and in Wales. So that raises the issue, which is within Wales, a city like Cardiff, which would see itself as the equivalent of a Birmingham or certainly a Leeds or somewhere else, which is getting these kind of powers now within England, are looking at saying we aren't getting the same level of powers within Wales. It's come down to the Welsh government. And I think that's one of the challenges which is going to have to be worked out more in this next term of the Senedd, because it is that sense of, and it won't be an exact match because the whole point is in England, you're missing that national scale. So there are things coming down to the combined authorities, coming down to the mayors, which are sitting with Welsh government in Wales and probably quite properly should be sitting with Welsh government. But then there's a question of how much within Wales can we give further devolution down to some of the city regions within Wales, but also again other regions. So again, the reason we're dealing with in rural Wales, the challenge there is that we don't have a central point to organise a city region around. We are a very different shape of area. So if you start devolving things to city regions, say Cardiff, what do you do with the more rural areas of Wales? And that's a bigger challenge in Wales than it would be in England, simply because of our geography.
And I think, to be fair, if you aren't chafing somewhat against the strictures of devolution kind of everywhere, then nobody at all satisfied with things as they are. But I think certainly working with the weft of policy, for certainly what I witnessed you doing and how clear it is are the ways in which your work can directly connect with decision makers. A lot of English scholars would kill for, 3 days in
Absolutely.
Wales.
And this is the great thing about working in a small country, and it's one of the things that's kept me in Wales over the last 30 years, is that there is that proximity to politicians, to policymakers, to institutions, which doesn't exist if you're working even in England. That gives us a level of access. It gives us a familiarity with individuals. We meet, and that has allowed us to build the relationships. And as we all know, relationships is what's critical in this space of policy-informed research or research-informed policy. It's having those working relationships, working through them, and we're in a very fortunate position in Wales to do that.
So I guess we're moving on to how you became engaged with the LPIP programme. In a sense, it really felt to me like projects and the funding, you already understood all the relationships and the networks that were on the piece, and it's given you a chance to take them a step further or to build on existing kind of relationships in the space. Is that how it worked?
It is. It is building upon a series of relationships we have and previous projects. So one of the things I was previously involved in was the Wales Rural Observatory. This was established back in 2003 and came out of, again, conversations between people like Terry Marsden, Mark Goodwin, and people in the Welsh Government around some of those meetings, some other informal connections of saying
Mhm.
what there was a need for a better evidence base
Mm.
for rural policy in Wales. The Welsh Government then funded this Wales Rural Observatory, which was a partnership between Aberystwyth and Cardiff universities. It subsequently became funded through, supported through European funding and more directly tied to the Rural Development Programme. So it ran for 10 years in total. In that time, we did a series of different projects on needs identified by Welsh Government. We ran a number of different surveys. And then we got to the end of the European funding period. And for various reasons, the funding didn't continue beyond that. And for the intervening years, I had a number of conversations with various people in this space of saying, well, we need something like the observatory back. There's a missing piece in our policy research jigsaw now. In fact, actually, the last data we had of these things is what the observatory is doing, and that's now out of date. So we had those set of connections there, and I was very interested to go along to an early briefing session which UKRI ran about its ideas of what it's still then called actually local policy innovation observatories, and the term that certainly resonated, and saw that as an opportunity to do something again of this nature. But I also wanted to take two key lessons, I think, from what we had done in the observatory into the new LPIP. And one of those is that I wanted us to be more inclusive in terms of who we were involving and the pool of expertise we were drawing upon. So the observatory had been a project directly between Aberystwyth and Cardiff. A very small group was involved. And I wanted to open up this opportunity to engage other expertise within Welsh universities and to allow opportunities for people to come involved. And the second thing is I wanted us to be working with a wider range of audiences and users. So we had been working directly with Welsh Government previously. They had set our agenda, and whether or not anything we did saw the light of day in the public was up to the Welsh Government. And
Mhm.
most of it did eventually, but some of it sat on desks of ministers and senior civil servants for quite some time till it got there. So with this one, I wanted us to work with a broader range. We quite deliberately didn't have Welsh Government as a co-partner, although we're working closely with them in many ways. But we built together other partners from local government, from the civil society, various community organisations, social enterprises, and drawing them at wider pool to think what are the needs there, what are the broader needs which exist within rural Wales. And we were able to use some of those existing networks to do that. We brought people together in a workshop. We had a bit of funding, course, and CCON funding to organise that workshop. And we collectively co-designed what the LPIP would look like and what its themes would be. So these have been core principles of how we've approached this. The other change I think was important, which reflects what was happening more broadly in the intervening decade, was the significance of working with communities
Mm.
and involving community-led research in what we're doing. Rather than just us going out and researching them. And so that's become another central tenet of our approach.
And we have spoken, obviously, having been at the ISTED Ford and at the Royal Welsh, some of those around female entrepreneurship, around crime and reporting in the rural context, and around cultural heritage. They have a very specific flavour, but they certainly had the feeling of being highly co-produced pieces of work. They were academic facilitated, really, rather than just "I've got a bright idea" kind of led. It felt to me anyway.
Absolutely, um, and it starts really with, I mean, a lot of what we do we call responsive research. So
Mm.
we're looking to our stakeholders and partners to say, what do you need us to do?
Mm.
So the idea comes from there, but you're absolutely right. The way we're then designing them, the way in which we are following up that work, we're working closely with various partners. Things like the crime survey. We had workshops where we brought together people from police force and Welsh governments and local authorities to say what should be on this survey,
Mm.
and then they've helped us to deliver that. The women in farm entrepreneurship, designing that, worked with the farming unions and with other groups, and we got their input in terms of what we should be asking. So that nature co-production is really very core, and it's been one of the most rewarding aspects
Mm.
of the LPIP is actually working with those partners and getting to understand more what they need and what we can provide for them.
So I don't want to make it sound like everything is perfect over there in that green valley far away, but it certainly feels to me, both through connection through the kind of way in which your various legs and arms have worked, but also that propinquity, that closeness to power. I mean, certainly, again, at the Royal Welsh Show, which we mentioned, launching your manifesto for rural Wales, feeding that directly into the Welsh
Mm.
LGA, and then more or less having it, repeated back to you, kind of chapter and verse in select committees in the Senedd and others. It feels like it's a really exciting place to take co-produced research and then take it quite rapidly, actually, into practice.
It is. I mean, I think this is a closeness which allows us to do some of that. But again, I think you're right to say, we shouldn't just rest on our laurels or actually have, look at this with real tinted glasses. No, this is challenging. That it is challenging to make those connections at times. And a lot of work needs to go into setting things up, building those relationships. Um, there are some aspects of policy where, and certainly some of the people I would work with in terms of the community engagement, community development, would be critical of Welsh Government in terms of the emphasis it puts on communities, that there hasn't been a kind of explicit community strategy or
Mm.
policy. And to some degree, the kind of localism agenda which was played out in England wasn't replicated in Wales. So that some of those tools which are there are different. So I think there are areas which are there's still room for improvement around that. And then there's the other big challenge, which of course it's one thing to actually speak to people and get people you're mentioning what you're doing. It's another for actually that to really feed through into policy and to deliver impacts on the ground. And I think this is, again, a challenge or something we need to take on board of our way of working, that trying to inform policy from academic work is a long-term game, it's a long-play game. You're not going to see immediate impacts from that usually. There may just be one time, something's happening where the government needs a really quick response, but usually it'll take time to do that. Now, we did work 20 years ago, more than that, in working with town and community councils in Wales, and we did a report for Welsh Government on that. That eventually led into legislation, but it was 8 years between when we submitted the report and when that legislation appeared.
Mm.
And that was for a piece of work which Welsh Government had commissioned with the intention of it feeding into policy in this
Mm.
legislation. So these things take time.
Mm.
And I think that's one thing we approach the whole LPIP programme, that we've got limited fund amount of time at present. We're not going to see the full benefits of this within this period. We're going to hopefully see these things being picked up and talked about by policymakers. We may start getting to policy documents and so on. Maybe in 1-2 cases we see them do under programmes. But actually seeing the delivery of these impacts and ideas is going to go beyond that, and seeing the difference it makes to people's lives in communities,
Mm.
which is really what ultimately in the day we're about. That may take 10 years to achieve. So we've got to be prepared to take the long view.
Brilliant. So I'm going to ask then about so the ways in which you've worked definitely exemplify sort of place-based scholarship, place-based leadership. Can I ask you what is the potential for this work reaching maturity and becoming fully embedded? So what you've described sort of from research question through being co-produced into a finding into and back out from policy as being a long-term process. But I just wonder, do you feel that a kind of fully mature place-based funding settlement for rural Wales, can you imagine what would change as a result, and what might the size of that prize be?
The prize from that is a approach to coming to, and it's across all policy areas. This is supporting the economy, but it's also about how we deliver public services. It's also about how we support culture and so on. It's recognizing that there's not a single solution which fits everyone. This is the basis of a place-based approach. How do we develop policy which is responsive to the needs of individual places, and then even more than that, responsive to the needs and interests of us communities within that, and how do we involve those communities in that?
Mhm.
So that's the goal we're working towards. I think we're in a time where there is increasing interest in that across different parts of the political spectrum and across different tiers of government, and both from those elected and the civil service elements of government. So there's a lot of willingness, goodwill here. The threat is that the short-termism of policy isn't prepared to wait till it's to be demonstrated, and that there'll be another fad along which actually pushes us out before it's been allowed to have its effect. But I'm hopeful that actually there is a recognition of the need to change some of the structures and the processes there to allow this. It's not easy because it often involves organisations giving up some of their power
Mm.
and pushing that down, being more open to suggestions. So it's not just a research link, which is challenging. It's actually about how policy itself works and is organised, and there are vested interests there who may or may not be keen to do it. But if we can start to demonstrate the value of this approach, and if we can particularly warn about the dangers of not taking the approach, and the wake up call, I think, is what we have seen over the last several years in Britain and elsewhere, which is a sense of what I call spatial injustice, and a sense of people in places feeling that they're not being listened to, that they're being marginalised, they're being ignored,
Mm.
and that contributing to a fragmented political um, environment. And to one degree, some of the opportunity is from some of those new political players who actually are quite community orientated
Mm.
and wanting to do more. But it's also from the established political parties seeing that threat to their position from new players and actually being persuaded that one of the ways to address that is to take action which can be more place-based approach, so that you're speaking directly to the interests of some of those voters who maybe are feeling a bit disconnected at
Mm.
present. I think there's an opportunity in the current political climate that we have to actually position and advance this place-based approach as part of the answer.
To sort of go deep rather than wide, in a sense. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was quite again back to the Royal Welsh. How surprising! The day that I was there, Princess Anne on one side of the showground, and then there was Farage on the other.
Mm.
And I know that the polling isn't perfect in Wales. Positive sample sizes partly, but the Senate election could return a completely unknown quantity, really, in terms of the kind of networks that you describe. You might
Yes.
have some brand new players to deal with. It'd be so we watch and wait. So in terms of solutions, then, can you describe something that's worked well in this space? So either the rural white paper that you mentioned or the observatory work. And again, what are the characteristics of doing deep work well?
I think in terms of things that work well, I think it's, again, these take long to actually say we've delivered something here. Let me mention a couple of things. I think one is in terms of how we connect policy through to research and make a difference. And I think the example there, I think it would be, I mentioned earlier what we're doing with town and community and parish councils, and that sense of there being an underused resource, really local scale community government, concerns there about levels of participation in them, about their capacity to do things. And we were commissioned by the Welsh Assembly government, as it was at that time, to do some work about the potential
Mm.
of that sector. And it started from a point, as often is the case, that they knew very little about what's currently happening. And I think over the intervening 10, 20 years from that, the work we did has then underpinned a whole series of initiatives which have increased the visibility of that sector. It's increased the powers available to that, so they've received additional powers, and some of those are using them very proactively in terms of things like engaging with the climate crisis and installing electric vehicle charging points, looking at community energy projects, and promoting awareness around that. Others have responded to some of the cost of living crisis and things like food banks. So they found a role there, and they're using some of the additional powers which really ultimately come out of the work we were doing at that time from that. And we've also helped to improve training and resources for that sector. So our work led into a kind of the consolidation of the representative bodies to speak to their voice. So there's lots of things there where actually you're sowing the seeds through this research of flowers which you're not going to directly be involved in, but will blossom from this and can make a difference in improving their area there. So I think that's an example there of what researchers fed into a place-based approach, or helping to consider a place-based approach. I think actually the other example I will give is actually around the delivery side. I'm going to flag something which again is still, I think, a concern for us in Wales at the moment, which is the great benefit we had over a 20-year period of community-led local development in rural Wales. With European funding, the leader schemes, Wales was one of the real pioneers in this space. There was some community-led projects which predated those European programs of really place-based action in communities, of trying to work out what those communities wanted and empowering from that. And that approach fed through. So some of the work done in the Welsh leader groups established ways of working which were adopted then across Europe. And there was a real benefit, I think, that these did help to regenerate the economy in most parts of rural Wales. And it particularly, I think, helped to establish sense of place identity
Mm.
and to think about how you built economies around that. So it helped support the growth of forms of tourism, which are community embedded, helped to protect and promote that cultural heritage. It created a soft infrastructure, as I call it, for rural communities to come together and meet. And I think it's a great success story there, which unfortunately has not really been continued post Brexit, because actually, as we've had to restructure those policies after Brexit, the tendency has been, on the one hand, to try to integrate environmental protection in with agricultural policy and to rethink that space, but also to come up with a more kind of regional based approach to look to economic development, which didn't really recognise the rural dimensions.
Mm.
And rural community development and the community-led local developed approach has fallen between those stools.
Mm.
And that's a real challenge, I think, for us, that we've lost something there. And I think it's something which, hopefully, by talking about place-based approaches and recognise the significance of that, we can try to get back.
It's so interesting, isn't it? 60 years of the Regional Studies Association event today. And, we really didn't make the connection between such good work like that and the European funding that we'd had in areas. And
Mm.
as a result, the public didn't see the benefit or feel the benefit of what were EU funding streams. And I've always been interested in how far we as a sort of regional studies community are responsible for not communicating clearly enough, kind of.
I think part of the problem here is that it's natural that the way we work in academia is that we kind of go through fashions, if you like, or waves of interest, let's put it that way, where something is new and we want to explore it and we do research on it. But then we actually get to the point where actually we've worked out how that's working.
Mm.
We've done the basis of that, and therefore the cutting edge of the work moves elsewhere.
Mm.
And I think that European work, and particularly in rural development, which is the area I know the best, I think that's happened. So there's a lot of really interesting work done in the 1990s, the beginning of the 2000s. And I said quite a lot of that done in work done in Wales. People like Peter Migmore, people like my former colleague Bill Edwards,
Mm.
people like Ren Day, did a lot of work on this. And out of that came this idea of a new approach to rural development and recognition that this is a new rural development paradigm from built from the bottom up.
Mm.
But we did that, we documented that, and those were all published, and people moved on elsewhere.
Mm.
And the leader schemes continued, the work continued, but we weren't continuing to publish on it, and we weren't speaking about it. So
Mm.
maybe that's where sense. So it dropped off a bit of the awareness from that. But I think that's it. I think we also have to. I don't think we should beat ourselves up as academics about some of this. Maybe this comes down to us how we communicate things publicly and how actually we need to do that in ways which isn't always talking about the latest
Mm.
toy we've got, the latest thing we're playing with, but recognizing these broader senses.
Mm.
But I think there's also something like where we fit into this model. If we're talking about co-production and co-design and collaboration and working with others, we have certain things we can contribute as academics, as researchers. And the most important of that is that thing of the starting point of understanding what's happening, getting to that initial data, thinking about what's new and how we innovate it. Actually, some of that, we're not necessarily the best placed people to go and implement that. And we're not necessarily the best placed people to actually do some emotional work about that and to explain these things in a larger sense and to make sure that these programs, what they're contributing is recognised by the public. So
Mm.
maybe that's how we need to think about how we work with others and the division of labour, which is part of those partnerships.
You spent a lot of time understanding the Welsh context. What's informed your thinking about good international lessons to import or steal?
As I said at the beginning, I spent 30 years working in Wales, and that's been a great place to start with an immediate doorstep laboratory. But I've always had broader interests. I've been interested in what I call the global countryside and thinking of how globalization works out of that. And the way I got into that work was really beginning to think, well, okay, the work I'm looking at in Wales and to some extent in England, how is this different elsewhere and how is it shaped by that? So part of that started thinking about Europe and lessons from elsewhere and the governance and expanding beyond that. And it's been interesting, for example, doing work in rural development in China and thinking, where
Mm.
are the differences in here? Where are the similarities? And what possibly could be learned coming back from these things? So There's certainly a lot of space for international learning. That's where international networks are important, whether they're the kind of academic networks. And I've learned a lot from involvement with the Regional Studies Association you mentioned, but also groups like the European Society of Rural Sociology and others, which have provided that space for working with others. I've been involved in European-wide projects, and they've been really important in terms of helping to facilitate this kind of sharing of knowledge of what works well. And we certainly, before we did the LPIP, we reported a project called Robust, which was looking at rural-urban differences. Again, with a kind of participatory model. So we were working in collaboration with the Welsh Local Government Association in Wales on a rural vision for Wales. But we stole elements of that from what people were doing, say, in Austria, where there's some interesting examples about local service provision and bridging rural and urban gaps. And we stole elements of it from some of the examples in the Netherlands and so on. So we're learning and incorporating those things as we went along. And that was really important to have those opportunities. I think one of the things I've also, become increasingly concerned with in recent decades is having two-way conversations and realizing that the ways we've done things in Britain and Europe aren't necessarily always the only way of doing things. So in an academic space of rural studies, Britain has been one of the key, one of the leading nations in terms of doing rural research. That actually Wales in particular has been lots of concepts and theoretical ideas and agenda setting literature coming out from us. And that's being picked up and used by people all over the world. But sometimes I'm thinking, well, I'm not quite sure how well this fits. If you go to China and you're using some of these ideas, which actually came out of critiques of the policy environment in Britain, do they really transfer there? So you start having conversations about what's happening here and one that might be different. Again, what I then became conscious of was not being the expert coming in to tell those countries happening, but also listening and thinking, okay, there is something different here. But what we're talking about in Britain perhaps doesn't directly translate. Some of it does, and some of it can use. So equally, are there things which are happening in these countries elsewhere which you can bring back here? And therefore, I think China is quite interesting because despite being a one-party state in a way, there's actually quite a bit of autonomy for local scale actors, government actors there, and thinking about some of the models they have really of community-owned businesses and what they're delivering. There's something we can learn from some of that. Some of the work I've done with colleagues in Taiwan, where we've talked again the Chinese idea of guanxi, which is about a reciprocal gift relationship being so important. Well, actually, that does exist in farms in Britain. We just don't call it that. But it's absolutely important to the way people work, particularly in rural areas. So let's learn some of these concepts and ideas as well. Some interesting work in Japan about how they're trying to deal with ideas of multi-locality of people living in different spaces. There's a really interesting policy in Japan which allows you to divert some of your income tax to a region where you don't live or work, but you have some affinity with, because income tax is to some degree devolved. So it could be your ancestral home. There's a family come from, you still have a connection, you're paying some income tax back there. It may just be the place you like going on holiday to.
Gosh, you can imagine with the sort of where Welsh diaspora in England. Imagine how that would translate, because there's
Exactly.
such fondness for Wales from, having holidayed there. You could kind of a legacy relationship. That would be really
Exactly.
interesting.
And it is, and one of the concerns we've got in Wales is about young people leaving rural Wales and going away, and the concerns about future populations. And one of the reasons for being concerned about that is that it gives us an aging population and it reduces the local earning population, and it has impacts upon revenue generation and so on. But are there ways of actually tapping into that diaspora, as I say, to bring some of that back? Now, I'm not expecting that policy to be adopted overnight, but I think it's an example of radical ideas we can see elsewhere in the world which make us stop and think about, could we do something similar here back in Wales and back in the UK?
That's really interesting. That's really got that's really animated me, that. Okay, so I mean, clearly there's another year to roll on the LPIP itself. What are you yourself working on next? What's next for you, Mike?
We've still got a lot to do. We've got another year to go. We are kind of about 20 or so months into this project. I kind of feel we're up and running on all engines and everything's happening. So there's a lot happening. Some exciting things happening. We've just, the last couple of weeks, awarded a series of funding grants for a new set of community-led research projects, which have come from an open call we've had of people coming to us with their ideas. And there's some really interesting, work there, projects working with ethnic minority and refugee and global majority populations about their understanding of climate change and their needs around that and how to integrate them into local environmental action. Really interesting project, which is partly involving a theatre company working with young farmers around issues of mental health. So there's exciting work being done there. We are about to commission a series of small policy-focused projects, which will be commissioned from research outside the LPIP. We've got an interesting range of topics there. Our innovation labs, where we'll be working with small groups through a process of thinking about a desired change or an objective and the barriers to that and how we overcome that and the solutions to that. And we're now at the stage of those workshops are completed, but we're selecting ideas from them to test as a proof of concept intervention. So one of those which is the first one really getting going, is about using food as a way of tackling social isolation and building community cohesion in communities. So doing supports of working with people in communities and the kind of community kitchen - communal meal model of bringing people in the community together around the meal, using locally produced food, cooking together, planning the event together, and doing something which actually the whole community is extending it together. So there's some really exciting projects coming out of this. One of the big things we still need to do, most of my work plan is now being implemented. One of the things we still have to do is what we call some dialogues. And what we're going to try to do there is to tackle some of the wicked problems facing rural Wales and use that as a way of drawing together some of those dispersed projects we're funding. So in that, for example, there's lots of work we're doing around food in different ways. I just mentioned one of them there, but again, some of the community-led research projects are doing that. We've got another project, which is kind of a more traditional research project doing that. Let's bring together all those participants. Let's bring together all the evidence we're generating through that and get people together for a couple of days working through that to try to come up with some central answer to these big, wicked challenges. So that's the final big piece of the jigsaw, which we'll be doing next year.
Brilliant. So underpinning all this work, there must be some characteristics then. You've met a lot of people, you've probably met them all. Can you think of a specific person who's a really good broker, as in takes the ideas and can bring them into a different context? And aligned with that, obviously a broker needs to dock with a place leader. Can you think of a really good place leader from your career?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a couple of ways. I think in terms of brokering, I think I'm particularly interested here. I've been thinking about this in terms of individuals with inspiration in linking communities and focus on that aspect of how to engage with communities and to bring them through. And there's two examples I'm going to give. One person I knew and one person I didn't know but I learnt about. And the person I kind of didn't know and learnt about is an American geographer called Bill Bungay, who was based, I think, in Chicago. And in the 1960s, he reacted against the traditional form of how geography was done of things and wanted it to be more organic from the bottom up. And he set up stall, I think it's Chicago, it could be Detroit, what a deal. I think he might have done it in both cities at different points of his career, if I remember correctly. But literally getting a shop front, opening it up to people in the community and saying to you, what interests you? What's the problems here? What can we do? It wasn't entirely the participatory model we're using now. It's still often, research is doing something about responding to those community needs. It was brokering that relationship between the community academia and brokering the access to knowledge of those communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I then, reflect. Second example of that is a former colleague of mine who I worked with very closely when I first came to Aberystwyth, and who we sadly lost to illness about 15 years ago, called Bill Edwards. And he was someone who was an old-style academic in many ways, very careful about what he did, take time to think through these things, really vast knowledge and really sharp brain, but someone who wasn't necessarily switched on to the conveyor belt of modern academia keep producing things. But what he's really excellent at doing was working with communities, and he really had an investment of that, of working with these organisations. As I said, I mentioned it earlier, but He did a lot of work doing community appraisals in individual villages and working through them. He helped design the Jigsaw scheme, which was an early community development programme in rural Wales. And that came out of a real passion for people and for communities, and the fact that you needed to put their interests first and we should be working with them. And it didn't matter, that didn't lead to a journal paper or something. It was about creating something, doing something better in that community. And that, again, inspires me as someone who's brokering something in that way. As you say, you then perhaps need to place leaders to work with. And again, I think coming from a rural context, there's a different model here. So sometimes we talk about place leaders. We've got the kind of hero model, and we're talking about the big city leaders, city mayors, high profile, and how we can change things. You don't really get this in rural locations the same way. What this is much more about is about people working quite quietly in different spaces. And often it does come down to individuals, but often it is about those collaborations which are there. And I think there's been a whole series of people I've worked with at different times, I've come across who've done that, who've been pioneering some of those initial leader programs. Someone like Joan Asby in West Wales, who's set up one of those first leader groups in Wales and is really active in developing those ideas. Others more recently who have been working. One of the people who actually came to our event at the Royal Welsh Show, but we've done work, is a councillor down in Cardigan here, Clyde Davis, who has over a period of years been, was a key person working with us in that community about taking that tone and initially thinking about how do we bring new technology into here and getting money for setting up a public Wi-Fi scheme, but they then built on this and how they use the data they were generating, data analytics, and they're using that in all kinds of ways. So in terms of how they respond to tour parties coming off cruise ships, which dock at Fishguard, and they've got the information, know exactly where they're coming, and they know what shops they're interested in. And they've used all this data they generated from having created this local Wi-Fi system and the network there. And there's a whole kind of thing snowballed out of this. They're now talking about community housing, and they'll come up time with other actions. And really, that is now from having been a slightly rundown community a few decades ago, is really a vibrant town, a lively town, lots going on. It's attracting people in, are coming to it because they want to live there and they want to visit there. And again, I think there are individuals who've been involved in helping to take a community in that way. So yes, I think that's the place leaders, I think in a rural context, are people who are catalysts, not people who are commanders.
Very good. Very infectious, your passion for your place. I can feel it. Just before we finish, I'm going to let you have a wave of my place-based innovation magic wand. You've got to be careful with it because it can grant you a wish. You have absolute power to do one of these things, but you must use your powers to make a tangible change to a specific place. Your change will be specific, measurable, actionable, recordable, and transferable. Smart. Magic is hard to get hold of at the moment and is subject to a 20-year reducing multi-year budget settlement. You can have, for rural Wales, a £10 million project fund, half an hour with the cabinet. Now, this is obviously UK centred on the cabinet. It can be the cabinet in the Senate, and a slide deck. You've kind of done that already. Editorial control of the front page of a tabloid newspaper, a clause to insert into a bill, a simple message that goes viral in social media on TikTok, or anyone as an advocate for your work, or, and this is really one for the nerds, the answer to something that has bothered you forever. Which would you like?
That's a really tricky question. And I think I'm going to cheat slightly because I'm going to go for the slide deck and the cabinet meeting.
Yes, very good. But you can make money as well. I know. I can see from your face you want the money as well. That's fine.
What that allows is to put, because actually then what I do with that. And what I do with that, I think, is to actually make a case to the cabinet for this approach we've been talking about. And actually to talk about need to unlock some of the blockages there. And some of us come from rules about how government works and treasury rules and other things and short-term project funding or whatever. And actually, I think what I'd use that slide deck about half an hour to do is to present a vision of what could be achieved for rural Wales if we allowed that potential, the liberty to come through and to do that, and to be then quite specific with them about what might be, how to remove some of the blockages to achieve that.
We just had a presentation again at this regional studies thing about someone worked for the GMCA, and they're saying that probably 50% of their work is crunching through with different government departments, what they expect from funding streams. I just thought, how mad? Why do we do this to ourselves? We tie ourselves up in so much kind of, the transaction cost of that is just extraordinary when you think that it could be used for much more benign things. Right, there you are. So that's what you do with the place-based magic wand, and then we'll all see the world like you do at the end. Excellent. I mean, it's been a really inspiring conversation. Thank you. And I've really enjoyed getting to see some of the work up close over the summer, as I've all said. We set out to mine insights from experts, real world case studies, in this case from rural Wales, practical tips and career advice, I'm not sure about that, and to spotlight solutions as well as to wave the place based innovation magic wand. And we have. Thank you very much, Mike Woods.
Thank you, Nicola.